background is in evidence-based medicine, and I'm a clinical epidemiologist. I worked prior with WHO and PAHO in DC, and I also worked for Trump administration as a COVID advisor. So I wanted to touch base on two things quickly. To support Dr. Marek, that day that they released the study, NIH, on remdesivir, that morning, about 11 o'clock, there was a high-level paper published in the Lancet by Wang et al. On remdesivir. And they found that there was 60% of adverse events in both groups, remdesivir group and placebo. And they stopped that trial early for harms. So when NIH released their study in the afternoon, it was on the heels of a devastating study on remdesivir. I wanted to put that on the record. Now, in terms of what Dr. Urso said, it's an excellent point. We've looked at the body of evidence on asymptomatic transmission, and we looked at all of the studies, and probably it is exceptionally rare, if at all it exists, probably at around 0.5%. It's very similar to the issue of recurrent infections. We've looked at the body of evidence across time, and we found that the idea of reinfections and recurrent infections is exceptionally rare, if at all, and it's often an issue with a suboptimal interpretation of the PCR results. We would actually like to see at least a 90-day period between test 1, test 2. We want to see at least 2 tests positive, PCR or antigen tests or genomic sequencing. So there are a lot of problems, and what Dr. also said is absolutely correct. The issue about asymptomatic transmission was used as a tool in this pandemic to drive fear and to get the population to almost lock down in fear. And you had 15-year-old Johnny, who was at the prime of his life, hiding at home, thinking that he was at the same risk as 85-year-old granny with 3 underlying medical conditions. And that has been a tragedy here, the fear in the population.
Dr. Alexander, while you're at the table, because I know in the email groups, you've done, the group, I would say, society, a real service in looking at all the studies. And one of them in particular is you've pointed out all the studies on the effectiveness of natural immunity.
Yes.
What's baffled me, I think in May of 2020, either FDA or CDC recommended against testing for antibodies, and prior to vaccination. We'll get into vaccine injuries here later. I think one of the concerns, and this was expressed, I know talking to you, Dr. McCullough, early on, that if you're, with the flu vaccine, the first thing, again, I'm just a layman, you go and you get a vaccine, the first thing they ask you is, are you sick today? Mm-hmm. We didn't do that with the COVID vaccines. So can you just quickly talk about all the studies that talk about the benefit of natural immunity, and also why it probably would have been a good idea, certainly in light of mandates, to at least test somebody for antibodies and recognize natural immunity in this response?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I've done a lot of work with Dr. Reish and Dr. McCullough, people like Dr. Cole on natural immunity. We looked at all of the available evidence and the science, the comparative effectiveness research, as well as high-level papers published for people like Dr. Marty Makary out of Johns Hopkins. And we put together about 150 pieces of evidence, and we've found conclusively that natural immunity is not just equal to, but far superior than vaccinal immunity. And I think there was this misperception from around the fall of 2020 to the beginning of 2021, when the vaccines were beginning to get to the completion phase and be rolled out. There were some studies put out there, some small studies saying that, look, your blood antibodies are waning, so therefore you're losing your immunity. But these public health officials at CDC and NIH, they knew better than that. They knew that they were misleading the public and they were misleading the government and the population. They knew better than that, that your serum antibodies can wane. But they knew that we had another compartment, your cellular immunity, your long-lived B-cell immunity, T-cell immunity, that was robust, potent, lifelong, durable. We had a study done around 2008, 2009, published in CIDRAP, that looked at the persons who, there were some persons still alive at about 95 years old from the Spanish flu, and they were infected. And what the research showed is that those persons who were still alive, their blood still produced a cellular response, T-cell immunity to Spanish flu 90 years prior. That evidenced to us the robustness of the immunity. And the reality about it is that, to be very specific, what we should have done was, in rolling out this vaccine program, and I have been an advocate, I question the vaccines only to be focused for high-risk groups, potentially 70 years and above, but across the board, no one else. So I want to put that on record. I'm not in support of these vaccines. I am in support of vaccines that are properly developed with the proper duration of follow-up, with the proper safety testing. These vaccines have not, children should never get these vaccines. But what we should have done, what we should have done was, before anyone was given a vaccine, in conjunction with proper informed consent, which I argue globally has never even happened today. Informed consent has been abysmal, but we should have done some serological testing for antibodies, or we also have a test available, the T-Detect test for cellular immunity, etc. And that has been a catastrophic failure, because we've been vaccinating people who've already recovered from COVID. And we have good studies by Kramer, by Matudiodakis, by Rohr, and there are 3 additional ones that show if you layer vaccinal immunity antibodies on top of COVID-recovered antibodies, you are at an increased risk of ending up in the hospital.
Okay, well, thank Dr. Alexander. And go to Dr. Malone first and Dr. Cariardi, but I don't want to, miss this question. Why was there the assumption on the part of our federal health agencies that natural immunity wasn't worthwhile? But let's go to Dr. Malone, put his tag up first, and we'll go to Dr. Cariardi.
Okay, I'm going to punt on the why question.
Okay.
For some reason, they don't consult with me.
I'll try to answer the why question, Robert. So that's
Good. Okay, you got that. So